Morning, Glory America. Bonjour, hi Canada. I'm Hugh Hewitt inside the Beltway again. A little bit chilly here, but not as cold as it is when the exchanges are between Supreme Court nominee Brown Jackson. Judge Brown Jackson did pretty well yesterday. She is clearly soft on crime, and she has some answers to provide for questions that will be forthcoming on critical race theory, but generally speaking, she will be confirmed. I always say that. You know, I wouldn't vote for her. I'm lowering my over-under. I thought she would be at 65. I'm down to 53 because the answers were so appalling on child porn and on critical race theory. And I'll talk with people about it later in the program. I'll play you audio. But let me bring you up to speed first of all. Ukraine's troop fights war of ambush and skirmish against Russian invaders is the lead story in the Wall Street Journal this morning. It begins, Ukrainian forces have inflicted significant losses on Russia's larger and better armed military, blunting advances by Moscow on several fronts, using insurgency-style tactics to take advantage of a grab bag of weapons provided by NATO. It's a war of ambushes and skirmishes. Mobile Ukrainian units, using their knowledge of the local battlefield, seeking to hit Russian forces' weak points, striking armored columns on the main roads, undermining the ability to fight by disrupting supplies. There is very much skepticism that they will be able to mount a second counteroffensive, other than local counteroffensives on various suburban areas of Kyiv. They're not doing very well in the south. I just retweeted a picture of Katrina Dyachenko, an 11-year-old gymnast killed in Mariupol, where it is the Ukrainian story just to destroy the town. They're going full Stalingrad, full Leningrad in Mariupol. They have, however, retreated in many places, according to British Telegraph, due to frostbite. They weren't ready for the winter. They weren't ready for a month-long campaign. President Biden is going to fly to Brussels today, where tomorrow he will try and bring the European Union together to escalate sanctions, including on the entire Duma, their Congress, every member of the Duma. Jake Sullivan talks a good game. President Biden stays awake. That's a good day for us. And how he does in Europe, I got asked that last night on Special Report with Brett Baer. After we were done talking about Judge Brown Jackson, the talk turned to Ukraine. Let me play my 2 cents there at the end of the show. Cut number 26.
The president was speaking at the Business Roundtable last night during our show, talking a lot about inflation and the economy, did speak about Ukraine and Russia, and then he had this soundbite that really perked our ears after we went back and listened to it about a new world order. Take a listen.
We are at an inflection point, I believe, in the world economy. Not just the world economy, in the world. It occurs every 3 or 4 generations. And now is a time when things are shifting. There's going to be a new world order out there. And we've got to lead it. And we've got to unite the rest of the free world in doing it.
We have to lead the new world order. Hugh, there are some shifts happening, especially in the Middle East. You have the Saudis meeting with China. You have Bashar al-Assad taking meetings with the UAE and the Saudis. You have Iran rising up in the eyes of this administration, obviously with this nuclear deal. There are shifts.
There are, and you cannot possibly deal with Iran as a mediator and then turn around and deter Putin on the other side from launching cyber attacks. What is most needed from the president in Europe is coherence. He needs to get the allies persuaded, as Jonathan mentioned, on a cyber response if a cyber attack is coming, so that it's unified, and they have to abolish the distinction between offensive and defensive weapons to Ukraine. It's all defensive weapons now. They need to get everything there that can move.
And so I just think this is a supply issue at this point. The Ukrainians fight, they vastly outnumber the Russians because it's a rising up of an entire people. And they are supported by the world. Russia has choked a major oil pipeline in a further threat to global supplies. And to that, we ought to respond, fine, we're going to up our production in the United States. We can do that. We can. We should have done that a long time ago. And we got to get going. We've got to replace the displaced Russian oil and bring the dictator to reason and get him out of Ukraine. Meanwhile, Israel had one of its major terrorist attacks in years and years. 4 are dead as a suspected terrorist in Israel attacks using his car and knife in Beersheba. Two mothers of three, Doris Yabas and Laura Yitzhak. Both are mothers of three, both stabbed to death. Rabbi Kravinsky, a father of four, and Menahem Yeheskel, 67, a brother to four, all murdered by a terrorist who has previously spent, I don't know how this happened. The terrorist who killed the Israelis in Beersheba was a ticking time bomb. He had been so designated by prosecutors in a previous case, and he was shot to death by civilians protecting themselves. So he has gone to the gates of hell, and four victims in Israel. I just want to remind people that they don't have peace because Iran pays for stuff like this. And as I said last night, we got to get out of that Russian deal. Now, to Judge Brown Jackson, which I want to spend the rest of the hour on. She's very smart. She's very poised. She's very good. She will be confirmed. I had my over-under at 65, but I didn't know about the child porn stuff, and I did not know about the critical race stuff. I really didn't. So my summary last night to Brett, let's start, well, I'll save it until after the break. It's this, is that she needs to do better to get above 53. I thought she might get people like Tom Tillis and Mitt Romney. I don't know. The answer that she gave on child porn, the sentence where the 18-year-old was watching, and Ben Sass detailed, and I'm not going to tell you, some of the most graphic and horrific child porn around, and she sentenced the kid to 3 months. 3 months for consuming. If you're a member of that market, you're making the market, and it's disgusting. I'll be right back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. I'm Hugh Hewitt, Inside the Beltway, joined by David Drucker, Washington Examiner writer, and of course, author of In Trump's Shadow. David Drucker, I'm glad we missed earlier in this week, because now you can tell me what you think about KBJ before the Senate. What'd you make of yesterday's hearings?
Well, it's really interesting, Hugh. I think it really kind of tells you where the country's politics are today, and it really is a great example of how prevalent cultural issues have become in our politics on the left and the right. From a Republican perspective, on the one hand, you can see multiple plots playing out, right? On the one hand, they're trying to treat her, at least some Republican senators, particularly respectfully, as if to say, we're not going to Kavanaugh her. We're not going to do to her what you did to Brett Kavanaugh, which is bring baseless allegations that have nothing to do with anything. On the other hand, we have some potential 2024 candidates who are staking their claim to some of the issues that matter so much to Republican voters. And then we have issues of the day that are very current now and in the midterm elections, with these questions about her views on crime, her views on critical race theory, and things of that nature. And so all of this is sort of together in a big political soup that tells you where we are and where we're headed in the next two elections.
Yeah, David Drucker, I originally set the over-under at 65 Senate votes for her because I clerked on the D.C. Circuit for Roger Robb and George McKinnon. Judge McKinnon was on the first sentencing commission. I was the clerk on that. I just think the D.C. Circuit is the natural training ground for Supreme Court nominees. So I read her record. I looked at her accomplishments, 10 years on the trial bench. I said, she'll get confirmed. Her answers yesterday on child porn sentencing with Josh Hawley dropped that over-under to 53, along with the CRT discussion. Do you believe she really didn't know anything about the curriculum at Georgetown Day School?
Well, I think it's possible. I send my kids to a private school. There's a board, and the board isn't necessarily involved in aspects of curriculum, but in management of the school, and particularly given that the board members have actual day jobs, and this is a side gig, it's possible. I would say, and I hate to debate court issues with you because it's one of your particular areas of expertise, that just as a matter of politics, I'd probably put her over under originally at, 55 if I mean generous, more likely 53, 54. She'll get confirmed. I just think it's hard in the current moment that we're in for members of the opposite party to vote for a president's nominee, whereas that nominee and those same senators transported, 20, 30, 40 years ago, with a few exceptions, and we're aware of what happened with Bork and some others, they would have just been confirmed, by massive margins.
Well, look, the difference between Amy Coney Barrett, Brett Kavanaugh hearing is there's no personal attack on her, as was illustrated by the conversation about her faith by Lindsey Graham. Doesn't matter to Lindsey Graham, doesn't matter to me how often she goes to church or what she believes in. The Amy Coney Barrett stuff was ridiculous. I don't want to go back and find her high school yearbook. But I do think across the United States there are school boards, public and private, that have duties to their parents to know what's going on in the school. I was just flabbergasted when she said, I am not aware of those books. Can you imagine being on the board of a school where those books are routinely taught and where race consciousness is prevalent, not knowing that it was controversial for some? Maybe it's not at Georgetown Day School. I mean, that's why I would ask her more questions. Maybe they never had a meeting that CRT came up at. But David, by the way, I'm down to 53. Her potentials are Murkowski and Collins, although I think she might have lost Collins yesterday, and she might lose Murkowski because of the election. And then our lame duck, Burr, down in North Carolina. I don't see Mitt Romney voting for her, not in 100 years.
Well, it depends on, I guess, how he approaches this. Based on some of his comments yesterday, I think that she still might win his confirmation vote. Look, the issue with boards and curriculum are a huge issue for parents.
Yep.
They're a huge political issue. They're just a huge issue, period. It's the sort of question, what I find interesting, is it's not the sort of question that any senator ever would have asked in a different time period, right? I mean, this is something that may or may not have anything to do with her legal judgment.
But, David,
where she's headed, but it matters.
I did a 90-minute interview with Bill Barr on Monday about his book, and in the middle of one damn thing after another is a very impressive diagnostic and explication of what race has done to the country and how the progressive left is marching through its institutions, including schools. From Bill Barr, very well argued. And that's why I think Christopher Rufo has pretty much condensed CRT as the umbrella under which all of these issues come. And I think we'll hear a lot more about it today. So next week, I'm holding at 53. The child porn stuff is what I think loses Mitt Romney. I think what loses anybody else is going to be CRT. We'll see. David Drucker on Twitter, David M. Drucker, author of In Trump's Shadow, the book on the 2022 elections. Donald Trump's role therein. Coming up, Byron York of the Washington Examiner. Stay tuned, America.
Judge, the court feels as though in this moment, per Mr. Young's compassionate release motion, the court is being called upon to evaluate the length of his sentence under the revised section of the law in the First Step Act. And so it is almost as if I am sentencing him today. And if I were to do so, he would face a sentence that would be well below the 240 months that Mr. Young received. And so for that reason, I will grant Mr. Young's motion. Judge Jackson, before you granted this fentanyl kingpin's motion to reduce his sentence, did you contact any of the victims from his case?
Senator, thank you for allowing me to address Mr. Young's situation.
I asked a simple question. Did you contact the victims in his case or not?
Senator, Mr. Young was not released. His sentence was reduced, and I did not contact the victims in his case because there were no victims. He committed a crime, a drug crime. There were no identifiable victims in his case.
Drug crime is not a victimless crime. 100,000 Americans were killed by overdoses.
Understood, Senator, but there was no one to contact because there were no identifiable.
Judge, you just acknowledged that you did not release him. You're right, you didn't release him. He filed a motion.
All right, stop right there. I'm joined by Byron York. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Good morning, glory to you. That exchange was astonishing to me, Byron York, because there are no identifiable victims. There are victims' rights groups everywhere. There are 100,000 dead Americans who have brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers last year. I can't believe she said that. What did you think of the rest of that hearing and that exchange?
Yeah, that was a stunning moment. The idea that fentanyl distribution is a victimless crime was just astonishing. And you're right; it's common in cases to bring in some victims' rights groups that will speak generally about the cost of one or another sort of crime. I have to say, looking politically at this, it's difficult to watch the whole hearings without thinking this is a done deal. I mean, it's just a done deal. It was a done deal going in. Democrats are absolutely, totally united behind this nomination. We've often talked about how in a 50-50 Senate they have to be completely united, and they have to have the vice president's vote. Well, they're completely united on this one, and they are going to get a few Republican votes. By the way, I thought you just said that you thought maybe Romney was going to peel off because of the
child pornography.
The child pornography thing. You may be right. There's a quote in the Washington Post this morning where they apparently approached him, and the reporters approached him in the hall about the sentencing guidelines discussion, and he said, quote, "It struck me that it was off course, meaning the attacks were off course that came from some, and there is no there." So,
well, I didn't think it was going to fly either. I was mostly concerned with her CRT answers and what she thinks about her duty as a Georgetown Day School board member, and I hope Ted Cruz returns to that. But the Hawley exchange about the 18-year-old in possession of 8-year-old and 10-year-olds, and please, if you've got young children in the audience, you just don't want them to hear what I'm about to say. The idea of an 18-year-old raping or watching rape videos of 8 and 10-year-old boys is so appalling that I just think Governor or Senator Romney may rethink it if he watches the exchange with Josh Hawley. I thought it was kind of a soft on crime political messaging, but that's actually mind-boggling to me as a lawyer. And I worked on the first sentencing guidelines as a clerk for Judge McKinnon in 1984 when they were mandatory. A 3-month sentence, Byron. Isn't that astonishing?
3 months, yeah. Can I make a comment about the press here, which is interesting, which is the White House has been pushing this idea that Senator Hawley, by bringing up this topic, is tapping into QAnon. That he's
I saw that.
QAnon. Well, the White House is doing this. I mean, with a straight face. Okay. So in the Post, in the Washington Post, they reported that the White House was doing it. It's not clear how many other Republicans in coming days will be eager to join his line of attack, which the White House suggested was intended to resonate with QAnon conspiracy theorists. Okay, so the Washington Post at least does us the favor of saying this is a White House thing. The New York Times, in its analysis of this, Republicans contended that the nominee had been especially lenient on purveyors of child sexual abuse imagery, a claim that spoke to a fixation of those wedded to the QAnon conspiracy theories. Many of its followers, some of whom took note online of the Republican line of questioning at the hearings, falsely believe that former President Donald Trump is fighting a cabal of elites, including top Democrats, who are in fact child traffickers and pedophiles. The New York Times just gives us this, doesn't say that this is some ridiculous White House charge or mud they're throwing at Josh Hawley. But that's the level of White House defense on this issue.
What an absurd, by the way, I don't care what the New York Times says or my paper, The Post, reports or doesn't report. The American people will hear that colloquy with Josh Hawley and they will raise their eyebrows about KBJ because they don't think an 18-year-old in the possession of 8-year-old rape videos ought to get 3 months in jail. And they think he deserves a sex offender designation and is probably troubled.
Yeah, and it's certainly a legitimate line
Absolutely.
of discussion. I mean, you may take, Andy McCarthy's position on this, which is fine, but it's a legitimate area to be discussed in the confirmation hearing. By the way, as the judge pointed out several times, it has to do with things she did as a judge.
Yeah, she is a judge.
She is rendered to high school, by the way.
No, we're not doing yearbooks. We're not doing how often do you go to church. I don't believe in any of that. There is one part of her private life I want to come back to, which is her service on Georgetown Day School Board and her avowal to Ted Cruz that she was unaware of the CRT-derived curricula and any other. And I want Senator Cruz to return to that and say, what exactly did you think your job was? Because all across the United States, school board members are going to use the KBJ defense this fall, Byron. Say, I didn't have any idea that we were teaching Ibram. I don't know what this stuff is. We don't teach CRT. It's all mind-boggling that board members don't know what is being taught or that they didn't receive any complaints. But I don't know, Georgetown Day School, I don't think she's telling a lie. I just think she was clueless as to what was being taught there.
Yeah, the standard defense of the left in the whole CRT thing is to say that CRT is not taught in schools. It's this abstruse academic theory that I can barely understand, and it's taught at the graduate level or at the law school level. So it's not something that's taught in our schools. Now, you're just making that up. And basically, she embraced that position, and so her position was that as far as critical race theory is concerned, it's an academic thing. I'm barely aware of it. It's certainly not taught in schools. And as far as these books are concerned, I had no idea they were there.
I had no idea. I've never heard of it. And so that, to me, is the crux. If I'm doing a deposition, I'd pause right there and say, you've never heard of these books. No parent ever complained. None of this was ever discussed in a board meeting. And I would drill down on that, largely because she's going to be confirmed. And by the way, if it's a 50-50 vote, the vice president is a member of the Senate, gets to vote break the tie and confirm her. Well, there's some people out there saying she doesn't get to confirm. No, that's not true. You got to get a Democrat defector. And John Ossoff of Georgia, for those of you who didn't vote in Georgia, and I'm on in Atlanta and Macon all through the state, Byron, so I want to remind those people who didn't vote in Georgia, they are responsible for the confirmation here, because I don't know that she would get over a Republican Senate. She is very smart. She is very poised. She is very good in defending most of her record. There are in every judicial record, there's going to be 1,000 decisions, and there's going to be a worse one, and Josh Hawley found it.
Yeah, and also, if Republicans win just one of those two Georgia Senate races, the hearings would be run by Republicans. They'd be run by Chairman Graham and not by Chairman Durbin. So that just makes all the difference in the world. But here again,
Byron, don't you think Republicans are kind of glad? We got a minute. I want to give you the last word. That they're kind of glad that this will be a close confirmation without a lot of fallout, because they want to contrast how they do it with how Democrats do it.
Yeah, well, you can tell that a lot of Republicans are scarred by what Democrats did in the Kavanaugh case. And look, this case it's never appropriate to do what Democrats did in the Kavanaugh case, and they're angry and they are still scarred by it. But they can't really take it out on Judge Jackson, because that's just not an appropriate thing to do.
And they won't. They are not going to slander her. They are not digging into her high school years, nor should they. But her record as a judge is very much, and as a currently serving board member, on the table. Byron York, thank you. Follow him on Twitter and at Washington Examiner, on Fox News as well. I'll be right back, America. It is the Hugh Hewitt Show. Back, America. It's Hugh Hewitt inside the Beltway. I began the show by reading you the headline from the Wall Street Journal: Ukraine's troops fight war of ambush and skirmish. I also told you that President Biden is going to sanction hundreds of Russian lawmakers, according to U.S. officials, every member of the Duma, and that Jake Sullivan yesterday said the president's trip to Brussels is intended to bring the European allies together to escalate sanctions on Russia. Will that work? Congressman Mike Gallagher of the House Intelligence Committee, House Armed Services Committee, joins us. He's, of course, from Wisconsin. Saw the beautiful little Gallagher girl on Special Report last night, Congressman.
Well, I'm blessed. When you marry someone so far outside of your league, it's good when she takes after her mother. So it was a very cute moment.
It was a cute moment. Brett had fun playing that. I thought it was terrific. Now, what do you expect out of the president's trip, or hoping for? What's the best case that could happen at the gathering in Brussels that they're assembling today? They meet tomorrow.
Well, the best case would be for the president to inject some urgency into fixing the MiG-29 fiasco, and if that is not possible, at a minimum, finding a way to take Slovakia up on its offer to provide the S-300 system to the Ukrainians, provided that we can somehow backfill them with Patriots from Germany. I know that it's complex. I know that it might require us to gap some air defense systems in other parts of Europe, but I think we can and we must get that done. And with the full support and urgency that the office of the presidency can bring, I believe it's very possible. Now, the bigger and more ambitious idea would be to somehow get the Turks to provide their S-400 systems to the Ukrainians. And the reason this is so intriguing to a lot of us, Hugh, is that not only is it a way to provide critical lethal assistance to the Ukrainians, it's also a way of getting our NATO allies to divest of legacy Russian systems that have been an impediment to enhanced cooperation. I mean, the reason we have a hold on the sale of things like F-35 to the Turks is not just because of human rights concerns in the Erdogan era. It's because they have purchased these Russian weapon systems. So if the president could somehow harness this renewed spirit in NATO to help the Ukrainians to also modernize its defenses and get rid of certain Russian weapon systems, that to me would be the best possible outcome of this trip. Now, we'll see what happens. We still have massive holes in our strategy, particularly the energy component, both the energy gaping hole in our sanctions regime and the fact that Russia continues to make over $1 billion from European energy sales in particular, but also our just completely counterproductive domestic energy policy here in America. I had no hope that the president is going to change course on that. He remains beholden to the progressive left and the climate change cult, and that's really causing serious concerns for our national security.
He's leading from behind again, and there is no other way to explain it. He has been late on everything except, I'll give him credit, he led on sanctions on Russian oil and gas because the United States doesn't use much, and Europe is sketchier on this, but I'm hoping he rallies people on this. Yesterday, General Jack Keane said on this show, we've got to erase the distinction between offensive and defensive weapons. Everything is a defensive weapon when your country is besieged. And he also wondered where the anti-ship missiles. Can you answer those two questions? One, is that distinction relevant anymore, or has it been removed? And two, where are the anti-ship missiles? They're killing Mariupol by sea fire.
Well, on the distinction, I think on your show before, I've said the distinction makes absolutely no sense. I mean, it's entirely context dependent, right? A bayonet, I guess, could be a defensive weapon if the enemy is overrunning your foxhole. It could also be an offensive weapon if you are trying to overrun the enemy's foxhole. So the distinction has never made any sense to me other than, you know, it's a way for academics sitting in air-conditioned offices in D.C. to, justify certain policies or that they might fear are escalatory. And I will say on that point, Hugh, my biggest concern with our approach to Ukraine right now with the Biden administration is they're so dominated by their fear of escalation, their fear of provoking Putin, that I think they fail to see that that fear itself is provocative. And I would argue further, the reason we got into this situation in the first place is because we allowed the fear of provoking Putin to dominate all of our actions. We need to be putting fear into Putin's brain and make sure that he is the one who fears escalation. We should be cognizant of the risks of escalation, particularly nuclear escalation, but we can't allow it to dominate our thinking as we try to help the Ukrainians going forward.
Am I correct, Congressman, that everything the United States has done since Russia invaded, you and others in the Republican Party urged that we do before they invaded in an effort to deter them?
Well, we failed, I would say, Hugh, if I understand your question, for what, the better part of 6 years to do everything possible prior to the collapse of deterrence to help the Ukrainians. And that was a bipartisan failure. And you could say that part of this just got caught up in the complex bureaucracy that is both the Pentagon and the intelligence community, but that's not an excuse. That should be a wake-up call that we need to modernize our defenses, particularly if Ukraine offers us an opportunity to forge a sensible middle path between an all-out, go-it-alone, massive infusion of U.S. military resources and troops on the one hand, and an isolationist, Fortress America, look inward, go not abroad in search of monsters to destroy strategy on the other hand. We've learned in Syria, in Iraq, in other places that if we act as an enabling force for allies and partners on the ground that are willing to fight ferociously for their own country and for their own interests, we can have a massive effect while still maintaining a light footprint. But we still are not comfortable yet fully with operating that way, and we still have massive problems within our national security bureaucracy that we need to iron out. And finally, Hugh, I would say what we've learned is that sanctions alone, non-military instruments alone, are not enough to deter, particularly when you're dealing with a brutal thug and dictator like Vladimir Putin. The specific form of deterrence that the Biden administration is arguing for, what will be the cornerstone of their national defense strategy, something called integrated deterrence, involves the elevation of non-military tools over hard power. It is a dangerous concept, and it is a concept that has now specifically been tested in Ukraine and has failed. Deterrence failed in Ukraine, and yet multiple Biden administration officials, when questioned by me in the Armed Services Committee about whether they view this as a success, have confirmed that they view the situation in Ukraine as successfully validating their entire intellectual foundation for the forthcoming national defense strategy. And we need to be very wary of that, Hugh, because that is the wrong direction to go in.
That's so stupid. That's so Aspen Institute, Davos, seminar room, college faculty lounge, unreal. Let's go to the reality of Mariupol, where integrated deterrence has resulted in a desert. So they made a desert and they called it integrated deterrence, to borrow from whoever said that about the Romans in Carthage. What is the best outcome here that you can foresee, Congressman Gallagher?
Well, I worry that now that the Russian blitzkrieg has failed, we're now settling into attrition warfare, and that's where the Russians could be more successful. They have basically three different wars going on in the country right now. Two are somewhat stalled, and one is advancing. In the south is where I'm most worried. I think they could continue to consolidate their gains, make incremental gains, and ultimately make sure that any negotiated settlement includes a demand for a land bridge from Crimea to Russia, which would be a massive gain for the Russians. The two dogs that haven't barked thus far that I suspect will bark very soon, one is Belarus getting involved and invading from the northwest, which would be very problematic for the Ukrainians and cut off their supply lines. And the other is Putin using cyber weapons, possibly even against the United States. President Biden warned of that. We need to be very wary of that. And the fact is, as I learned in co-chairing the Cyber Solarium Commission for 2 years with Senator Angus King, we are very vulnerable domestically, particularly when it comes to our critical infrastructure. Think your local utility, water, power, things like that. That is really where we are vulnerable. And if this continues to go on, as much as the administration might content itself to think they're bleeding Russia dry, or the Ukrainians are bleeding Russia dry, we could still be very vulnerable here on the homeland. So those are just some things to watch for that worry me. And again, it comes down to this basic proposition that for Putin, human life is cheap. So he's willing to sacrifice a lot of lives so as to save face, as well as to, carve out at least half of Ukraine. We need to put Zelensky in as strong a position as possible if and when he chooses to pursue a negotiated settlement.
So last question, Congressman. We used to have mutually assured destruction, and that still works for the nuclear side. But on the cyber side, we need MACD, mutually assured cyber destruction. Do you think NATO will join us in stating clearly that Article 5 applies to cyber attacks?
I don't right now. But one thing we do recommend in the Cyber Solarium Commission is to have it clarify our signaling policy as well as our response policy along the lines you suggest. Ambiguity might work in some areas, but not when it comes to cyber. And furthermore, Hugh, where we really need to work in partnership with NATO is to go on offense. We're not nearly where we need to be in terms of launching offensive cyber operations with the rapidity that we need to launch them. And in some cases, it's more difficult to get offensive cyber operations approved than it is to get lethal drone strikes approved, which makes
that's crazy. Sense. No, whatever they hit us with cyber-wise, we ought to hit them 5 times as hard. And the Russians might have a very good GRU unit doing this, but they ain't got the NSA and the European allies. Last question, the anti-ship missiles. Now, I'm told harpoons are not the world's greatest weapon system, but if they're shelling Mariupol into nothingness, isn't at least shooting at the ships worth something, Congressman?
It is, but it gets to this, and I quite honestly don't know where we are with the shipment. It's something we need to, when we get back into D.C. next week and we're having hearings, we need to look into. But it gets to this broader issue where, from the start, we basically abandoned the Black Sea. We just abandoned it, and the Russians have dominated it ever since. The Russian presence in the Eastern Med has really picked up. So the naval aspect of this has been a complete surrender, and that's very problematic, Hugh. We should have had naval assets in the Black Sea. We could have had an influence. We could have had a deterrent effect on the ground in Ukraine if we had not abandoned the Black Sea.
I agree. Congressman Mike Gallagher, thank you as always. Rep Gallagher on Twitter, at Rep Gallagher. Every week he brings us up to speed, and we didn't have to have any Packers talk this week, thank goodness. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt inside the Beltway. Day 3 of the Judge Brown Jackson hearings commence soon over at Senate Judiciary. A member of that committee is Senator Tom Cotton. He joins me now. Good morning, Senator. Thank you for joining us. What did you make? By the way, I thought your exchange with her on the sentencing of the heroin fentanyl dealer was quite remarkable. She said there were no identifiable victims. I mean, you thought of the children in the house, but you also pointed out drug abuse, drug sale is not a victimless crime. I'm still stunned by that. Heroin laced with fentanyl is a weapon of mass destruction, Senator.
Yeah, good morning, Hugh. It's good to be on with you. I thought that my exchange with Judge Jackson, and specifically the exchange about the drug kingpin, Keith Young, whom she sentenced and then resentenced, was very telling. It goes to show that she's soft on crime. She's an activist who has spent her entire career advocating on behalf of criminals, trying to seek weaker sentences and weaker criminal laws for them. Let me just lay out what happened in Keith Young's case. This man was a career criminal. He had had multiple convictions. He came in front of her court in 2018. He faced a 20-year mandatory minimum for having heroin laced with fentanyl in a home where he had his own children. The judge expressed her frustration that she had to impose a mandatory minimum. She even apologized to this drug kingpin that she had to impose the mandatory minimum. Well, fast forward 2 years to 2020. Keith Young comes back to her court, and he has filed, under the First Step Act, something called a motion for compassionate release. That means immediate release, Hugh. It was for elderly and terminally ill inmates. Keith Young was neither of those. And I'll give her this. She denied the motion for compassionate early release. He was not eligible for it under the First Step Act. But then, Hugh, she took it a step further. She transformed that into a motion to reduce his sentence under the First Step Act by 7.5 years. And, Hugh, the law that she cited was not retroactive. It was specifically not made retroactive by Congress. Yet she felt it was unfair that he had a 20-year sentence because he was sentenced before the First Step Act, and others who committed the same crime got a shorter sentence after the First Step Act.
Yeah, Senator, if I understand correctly,
rewrote the law.
If I understand, it's a sua sponte motion on her part. If you move to reduce on the basis of compassion and that's rejected as she did, then there's no motion before the court. So she is doing it on her own initiative. Am I correct?
Yes, Hugh, because she said, and she, remember, in 2018, she expressed her frustration that she had to sentence this fentanyl kingpin to 20 years. She apologized to him. And then 2 years later, she gleefully celebrated that he was back in front of her as if it was a first sentencing. And she did not give him the compassionate release. Remember, Hugh, that's an immediate release from prison. An immediate release from prison for elderly and terminally ill inmates. He obviously did not qualify that, and she did not get it to him. But she converted it, sua sponte, of her own accord, to a motion to reduce his sentence years from now by 7.5 years. Because for 2 years, she had pouted that she had to give him a 20-year mandatory minimum. It goes to show that she is an activist on behalf of hardened criminals, and she always has been.
Now, I listen to these things very closely as a con law professor, and that just struck me that she had to do that ab initio on her own initiative, sua sponte. And the other one, when Mike Lee starts talking about the dormant commerce clause, I might be the only person in America who's listening, but the other exchange was Senator Cruz on critical race theory. What is a Georgetown day school board member supposed to do if not know what's in the curriculum, Senator?
Well, you would think that the board members of any private school would be reviewing the curriculum, especially things that are highly controversial, like critical race theory. Liberals like Judge Jackson have been saying for years, like, oh, this is a graduate school and law school seminar theory, and it's not exposed to children. That's funny because charlatans like Ibram X. Kendi, who have gotten famous and wealthy peddling such racist nonsense, have books out entitled How to Be an Anti-Racist Baby. Obviously, the far left is trying to indoctrinate children down to kindergarten to hate America and to judge each other by the color of their skin, not the content of their character, as Dr. Martin Luther King had it. And Judge Jackson was totally oblivious that this was happening at her school. And she has, in fact, cited in the past that she relies on critical race theory as she goes forward in sentencing, because she thinks it's such a fascinating combination of things like criminal law and administrative law and critical race theory. So her answers yesterday about critical race theory were simply not credible.
Senator, I am not a senator, and I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn last night, and I'm not on the Judiciary Committee. But if I were, I would begin with, how often did the board meet? What year did you join? How often did you attend the board meetings that were scheduled? Did CRT or any controversy surrounding CRT derived materials or teachers influenced by CRT ever come up in any board meeting? And if so, what was the conversation? I'd move deposition because it's not just her problem. It's a problem on every school board in America, private and public. Now, on the public side, it's unconstitutional to have race. But on the private side, it's astonishing. Do you see yourself focusing on that or on criminal law today, or what do you expect yourself to be doing today?
Well, Hugh, we have another long day ahead of us here. I still have some questions about her views on criminal law and sentencing and other matters. I'm sure, though, that there's going to be a fuller exploration of her role as a board member and whether or not she was aware of what her school was teaching and supported it, or whether she was negligent in that role and that she was not aware of what her school was teaching. Neither one is particularly, a good look for a judge.
No, it's not. They're both actually. I had the over-under at 65 until yesterday. I dropped it to 53 because I also think Josh Hawley's discussion of child porn, where she lets an 18-year-old in possession of child porn involving 8 and 10-year-old boys being raped, to 3 months. Senator, my jaw dropped.
I know. It's amazing. And she apologized, again, Hugh, in the hearing with that criminal defendant. She apologized to him. She apologized to this 18-year-old man who was in possession of material of child rape, Hugh. She apologized that she had to sentence him even to 3 months in prison, which was vastly lower than the recommended sentence under the guidelines.
Yeah.
Hugh, there was a lot of back and forth on this question yesterday. It may have been confusing to some people. Here's the bottom line. There are a lot of elite lawyers in America, judges like Judge Jackson, even some federal prosecutors, definitely federal public defenders, definitely law professors, who think criminal sentences for child pornography are too harsh. Not many Arkansans do, and I certainly don't. And what Judge Jackson consistently did when she had child pornography cases was use her discretion as the sentencing judge to recommend one of the lowest sentences possible. Now, if I were the judge and I had that discretion, I'd probably throw the book at the child pornographer. Maybe that's just me, but I suspect it's not just me. I suspect it's most Americans as well.
Well, what I think was missing by some of the people who accused Senator Hawley and others of being QAnon responsive, which is an idiotic charge, but because child pornography is a massive plague on the world, does she believe that consumers of child porn create the market which incentivizes people to make it? Because that is the causal element that I don't think anyone brought to the surface, which is if you're consuming it, if you're downloading it, if you're watching it, you've created the market for it, and you are incriminated in the production of it. That's my view of the marketplace, Senator. Do you share that or disagree with that?
Well, Hugh, I don't think that's really your view. That's just the basic law of economics, of supply and demand. Of course, if there's more demand for anything, to include criminal material, to include the most heinous criminal material, there's going to be more supply of it. But I doubt that she would even agree to that, Hugh. Yesterday, I asked her, does she think that there will be more or less crime if criminals are more likely to be caught, convicted, and sentenced? And she wouldn't even acknowledge that, Hugh, a very common-sense proposition. She acknowledged that deterrence is one of the purposes of punishment, and that there's theories and research that support that, but she wouldn't actually acknowledge that deterrence works, that good policing and tough sentences works to reduce crime, because she is a far-left activist who always takes the side of criminals.
You know, Senator, I began yesterday thinking 65 votes because she's a liberal, not a leftist. I'm down to 53 as the over-under because she's a leftist. That's far left of liberal. I judged Attorney General Barr on Monday talking about this. Do you think do you think there are any members of the conference that will vote for her after yesterday's testimony?
Boy, Hugh, I think that'd be a very tough vote for most of our peers. I'd probably put the line at 49.5 and hope for the under.
Okay, yeah, I really don't know how you get over your exchange. There was no identifiable victim. I think you were stunned by that. I was watching live, and you paused for a minute, and you said, there are no victimless crimes. And she genuinely believes if you haven't got a body, you haven't got a victim. 2 pounds of heroin laced with fentanyl. Did she not get any testimony from victims groups on what that means?
Well, she could have easily done that. She could have easily gone to the organizations that represent the families of overdose victims. But she obviously didn't want to do that to you. Remember, this is a career criminal, a fentanyl kingpin, who she apologized to when she sentenced him in 2018 because she thought 20 years was too tough, but the law bound her to sentence him to 20 years. And then 2 years later, when she gets him back in front of her courtroom on a completely extraneous, unrelated motion that she denies, she decides that she's just going to lop 7.5 years off his sentence. Years from now, she's going to get out of prison 7.5 years earlier because she thought the law was too tough to sentence this fentanyl kingpin to 20 years in prison.
I have a constitutional bias towards confirming qualified judges, and obviously you're the kid on the committee because she and Ted Cruz were palling it up at Harvard Law School. But honest to God, what were they teaching you there? She gave a speech at my alma mater, Michigan Law, which got into the record yesterday. But what goes on at Harvard Law School? Honestly, what do they teach up there?
Well, Hugh, a lot of what they teach in many classes is the kind of radical views you saw yesterday. That criminal law is inherently racist and it's a system of oppression. They teach you that criminals deserve our sympathy and that we should view the world from their standpoint. I mean, look at some of the transcripts of these child pornography cases or the case with the fentanyl kingpin. She openly expresses her regret that she has to impose longer sentences on them than she wishes. So she feels bad for them. And what do you remember when for them in the future?
When Justice Gorsuch was up and they made the frozen trucker case the headline. Now, though, that you're focused on specific cases, you are being accused of playing to QAnon. You are being accused of playing to the far right on crime and race. You got 1 minute, Senator. What do you make of those accusations that you're playing to QAnon and to far right supremacists?
Hugh, the only thing that I'm raising are what concerns every American in the middle of the crime wave, that Joe Biden and the Democratic Party have been releasing hundreds of thousands of violent and serious felons from prison, that they want to eliminate the bail system so violent felons don't even stay in, that they want to reduce sentences so future convicts don't go to trial so much, that they want to defund the police, that they nominate judges like Judge Jackson to the courts that apologize to child pornographers and fentanyl kingpins for having to sentence them to longer sentences than they desire. For every mom and dad who's worried about their kid walking to school and facing crime or overdosing on drugs, or worried about the quality of their public parks, and you have criminals hanging around them, I think yesterday was very eye-opening for the kinds of judges that Joe Biden has been nominating, not just this judge in the Supreme Court, but on down to every court in America. And I think the American people are going to express their dissatisfaction with the Democrats' soft on crime policies this November.
I agree with you, and on the CRT school board races. Senator Cotton, thank you. Follow him on Twitter at Rep. Tom Cotton. Watch these hearings.